understanding China has become more difficult than ever, yet also more important than ever. Whether the U.S. and China are rivals, partners, or a mix of both, effective policy will only be as good as the information on which it is based. My name is Scott Kennedy, and I'm the Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I also have had the privilege of being one of the few American scholars who has traveled back and forth between Washington and Beijing in recent years. I'm a firm believer that field research, direct observation, talking, and listening to Chinese perspectives must be a part of our toolkit to understand the People's Republic of China. So join me as I speak with Chinese leaders from business, government, and academia, and foreigners who have spent many years living and working in China. What makes China tick? Where is the country going? What connects us? And what divides us? We'll dive into all of that and more on this podcast. Welcome to China Field Notes. Welcome to China Field Notes. This is Scott Kennedy. I'm here with Kent Kedl, who is one of the savviest observers of China I have ever met. Kent, for many years, was managing partner at Control Risks, responsible for Greater China, as well as served in positions covering North America. He's now founded his own advisory firm, Blue Ocean Advisors, and is still following and tracking China for all of us. He spends a lot of time in the mainland. He also spends some time across the Taiwan Strait. We are lucky to have him with us here today on China Field Notes. Kent, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Welcome.
So you've been following China for about 40 years now. Tell us a little bit about how you got interested in China and ended up working for Control Risks, a firm that tracks political risk issues. And I guess we should say at the outset, you're just sharing your own opinions. You don't speak on behalf of anybody else, whether it's Control Risks or any government or anything like that. Just want to make sure everybody's got that clear. So, but tell us a little bit about how you got interested in China and your career.
I'm from Minnesota originally and grew up there. My first year of university at the University of Minnesota, I was studying speech communication radio, and then I was working almost full time in radio at the same time. And it only took about a year to realize that I was going to school for something that I was already working in. And I just kind of spun a little bit and kind of lost direction. Talked to my father. My father and I are very close, and he said, well, the worst place to find out what you want to do in school is to be in school. He said, so go get lost and find yourself, which was the gutsiest thing any human has ever said to me, let alone a parent. I'm 19 years old, so I went and did nonprofit work for a couple of years and ended up in the Philippines. And while there, I picked up a book on Chinese history, which I found fascinating. Just the length and the breadth and the depth was amazing. And on my way back to the States it was either 84 or 85, I honestly can't remember, I came through China. And I remember visiting and traveling around a bit. And I remember just being it was Guangzhou, I think, at the time, and during rush hour. And a kid from Roseville, Minnesota, rush hour just wasn't a concept. And in China, it is certainly a theme. And just this mass of people around me. And I was intrigued. It was just the most amazing place I'd ever seen. And I thought to myself, I don't know what I want to do, but I want to do it here. So it was really kind of more of a location vision than anything else. Went back to the States, changed my major to English, and then started teaching English in China in 1988. And I've been living and working here ever since then. So it was more of an addiction than anything else, I think. I probably would have been on the ADD spectrum as a kid, very distracted, really didn't know, very difficult to concentrate. I found out that in China, that's an asset, not a liability, because things change every 45 seconds. And it's been great. It's been really amazing.
Well, I've used that term addiction as well, because, I didn't have a lifelong plan to get interested in China. I just, at my grandfather's suggestion, started studying Chinese in the mid-'80s and then went to study there in 1988 and then got addicted and have kept going. So how did you go from teaching English to then getting involved in helping multinational firms figure out how to navigate all of the politics and policy of doing business in China?
I actually started pursuing a career in academics and did a master's degree in Chinese philosophy. Just a warning to your listeners, not a lot of employment trajectories off that degree. So if you're thinking of majoring in anything, Chinese philosophy is not a real money spinner. And then started a PhD program, which I never completed. But when I was in my PhD program, I started working. I started doing business consulting. And honestly, I mean, I couldn't spell P&L at the time. I had no idea what business was, but I was speaking some Chinese and was willing to kind of figure things out. And so in the early days, helped set up academic programs. First of all, I discovered that I was kind of China's worst English teacher when I was actually teaching, and I was better suited to setting up programs and running programs. So did that for a while, and then started helping set up businesses, distribution, suppliers, these kinds of things. There's just so few people here doing that at that time, where you could do something that you were completely unqualified for, at least at the outset. And then you quickly got the qualification to do it. And then in, I think it was 93, I had a consulting gig I was doing, and then did the first thing that consultants should never do is you sign on to implement your own recommendations. You know, if you're a smart consultant, you leave them with a PowerPoint and say good luck and, you know, blame the lack of execution on its failure. But I signed on for the software company at the time. So I was in IT for a few years and very involved in manufacturing, things like that. Then set up a business in the late 90s that was helping companies get into China and understand what to do and how to do it. So it was a strategy, and did mergers and acquisitions and things like that all the way through the aughts, and then sold that company and then joined Control Risks in 2011. So kind of went from the strategy side over to the risk management side of things. The timing was good because, and even now, I mean, strategy is important, but strategy is not the number one thing, I would argue, in China. You know, back in the day, strategy was important because we had to build everything ourselves. You had to decide what to do, where to do it, how to do it, build your supply chain, build your distribution. A lot of that is built right now. So you can kind of come in and figure that out. The really critical part, the roads are built. The critical part is avoiding the potholes on the road. And that's kind of how I look at risk management, is helping companies execute what they need to do while avoiding the potholes in the road. And there are probably more potholes now.
Yeah, let me see if we can go back to some of these early road building moments. You probably helped a lot of companies who had never gone to China before, but envisioned 1.x billion consumers and a vast labor pool to draw from. And what were some of the most obvious mistakes that companies were making that they benefited from you helping them avoid in the early days?
I mean, I think the most obvious one, and it still happens now, is that companies just assume that whatever they're doing back in their home countries will work here. From what the product is, to what their supply base looks like, to how they distribute, either direct or through distribution, how they manufacture, how they interact with local authorities. And, you know, China has progressed a lot since, you know, you and I were back here in the early days. And it is more similar to what I would call an international standard in terms of processes and procedures and things like that. So, you know, it's 80% there, but it's that last 20% that's the magic, right? That's the last 20% that means you're successful or not. So it was really that last bit there. At the time, my business partner and I, early 2000s, we wrote a book called The China Ready Company. What came out of that, the reason we did that, is that we would talk to companies and they just weren't ready for China. They had the wrong points of view, the wrong view of the market, sometimes the wrong motivation as well. The motivation was a little messed up. Believe it or not, there was a lot of motivations in the early days of big multinational companies that they had to come to China because everybody else was. It just was one of those things that, you know, CEO wanted to talk with his buddies at the 19th hole of the golf course about the latest acquisition that they were making. And even in the early days, I would challenge clients to say, why are you coming to China? Why do you want to buy a company here? And because everyone else isn't a legitimate excuse. It isn't a legitimate motivation. But there was a lot of very tunneled thinking back in the early days that it had to be China because of what was happening in China. And that's where we get right now where the global supply chain runs through China because everybody was jumping in. Now they're starting to think, oh, wait a second. Maybe I need to balance things. Yeah, maybe I overdid it a little bit here, which is healthy. It's a very healthy thing to do.
Of course. I remember when I was starting to get interested in China, and a company came and visited me when I was working in another think tank, and they told me that they were going to go to China to sell their medical fabric in China for tea bags because Chinese drink a lot of tea. 40 years later, certainly there are Chinese who use tea bags. But at that time, Chinese just put leaves open in a jar with hot water. And that was unexpected for them. But, maybe now, if they did the long play, they'd be all right. So you shifted to helping companies operate inside China and navigate the potholes. And there are a few kinds of potholes. There's potholes the Chinese create. It's regulatory system, it's politics, all of those things. And then you've got potholes that the U.S. may, from a distance, impose, or others, regulations about not getting involved, say, in Xinjiang, or being, attentive to human rights concerns, or other types of, PR issues or things like that. How do companies, or how should companies think about sort of the China side potholes versus the externally imposed potholes that come from a distance?
Yes, good question. I mean, I think the interesting thing to note is that the foreign created potholes is a relatively new phenomenon, right? You and I have talked about this before, that the greatest force of instability in the U.S.-China relationship right now is the U.S. It's not China. The greatest place of unpredictability is the U.S. probably right now. It used to be that was China. What's China going to do? And when I shifted into risk management, this is in 2011, right when Xi Jinping came in, and one of Xi Jinping's principles was we're going to go enforce the regulations that are on the books. Doesn't matter if the regulations are incomplete or old or whatever, we're just going to enforce what's on the books. And it's important to note that Xi Jinping administration started enforcing on local companies, on Chinese companies. There is this perception that they're gunning for foreign companies. I still would argue that they're not. But it was unpredictable because it wasn't quite sure where to go. You couldn't look at a regulation. The instructions for enforcement were never, and still are not, baked into Chinese regulations. The enforcement is quite separate. So there's a lot of unknowns in the early days. But as, getting into the late Obama years and certainly into President Trump, the unknown about where this is going to go has greatly increased. And the number one risk for companies anywhere in the world is the unknown. We hate being surprised. And so I think companies now need to understand that they will be surprised. Just stop thinking you're not going to be. Stop thinking you can crack the code on having everything perfectly defined. The challenge now is in responding to the unpredictability. And so you come back to things like scenario planning, which is, been used for decades with companies. I had a client a couple of years ago come to me and say they want to do it's a European company. They wanted to do a geopolitical risk assessment. And this is a new thing in China here in the past 5 or 6 years too, the impact of geopolitics on business operations. It was always a headquarters issue. But here, we'd open up the newspaper in the morning and read it. It was kind of interesting. But then we just close it and get on with making whatever we do. And this client of mine came to me and said, I'm concerned that I'm going to show up at my Chinese customer tomorrow and they're going to say, hey, we really like you, but we've been told that we can't buy from you. We're told that we have to buy local. And so this Asia CEO said, I want to do a risk assessment on that. But she said, we only want you guys to help us with a worst case scenario risk assessment, which I thought was interesting because usually you do, best case, most likely, worst case. And she said, listen, you're not going to tell us anything about our best or most likely case. She said, we've been here for 40 years, she said. But she said, as a company, we are not designed, it's not in our DNA to question ourselves. We wake up in the morning and say, yes, we have challenges, but we're good enough, we're smart enough, and here we go. We know we're not. She said the worst case scenario has been the most likely in the past couple of years. Trade wars, global pandemics, actual wars, all these things have been on people's worst case list. She said, so we need to think very carefully about that. I said, so what you're looking for is some reasonable paranoia. And she said, exactly. We need reasonable paranoia. And so I think that's absolutely critical for companies to think that through right now in ways that they've never had to before.
Good. Reasonable paranoia. I think it should be a good title of a book. Your next one. The one question that brings up then is the reasonable paranoia that you hear in Washington and from some companies are in technology related sectors that believe there is a finite window for them to be successful in China. China invites you in, gives you benefits, helps you produce, succeed, and then they set up a joint venture or a business across the street, suck away your technology, and then kick you out of the market and then go for the global market. That is a narrative that one hears a lot in Washington and other places. And again, one can have reasonable paranoia. And there are some examples where one can look at how the Chinese have ended up doing that. China does want to move up the technology ladder. Do you think that that basic story is a feature of what American and Western tech companies face when they go to China? Or is that an oversimplification of what the environment's like?
I think it's an oversimplification, and it also ignores history. Go back here to when those initial deals, foreign companies were coming here, those initial deals, and I was involved in quite a few of those. Now, I can only speak to the ones that I was involved with. In no case, none, did foreign companies feel like a gun was being held to their head that they had to transfer technology. They were joyfully doing it. They were running with big smiles on their faces with their technology and their IP gift wrapped to turn over to the Chinese side. They understood fully, and the Chinese weren't hiding anything. They said, listen, we need to move up the chain. We need to learn how to do this. Can you guys help us learn? And the foreign company said, again, in my experience, the foreign company said, yes, we can do that. But talking with these foreign companies afterwards, almost to a person, they said, China's never going to be able to do what we do. We have an absolute brick wall here with our IP. They're never going to be able to figure this out. They're never going to be able to reverse engineer it. They're never going to be able to do this. And it was a very risky bet. As we've seen, China has been able to do it and has been able to reverse engineer things and has been able to improve on them as well. China is still an incredibly welcoming place to foreign companies. And this is the message I think that's not out there, particularly in the U.S. You got to remember that the unique part of the U.S. right now is that China is a domestic political issue in the U.S. People are voting in national elections based on their view of China. And politicians are, on both sides, are rushing to see who can be the biggest China hawk. You don't have that in any other country in the world. Germany a little bit here and there. We used to have it in Australia here a few years ago under the Scott Morrison administration, but this is a pretty unique thing. So that drumbeat of negativity is happening. On the contrary here, we see Chinese authorities being incredibly welcoming to foreign companies, not just anyone. If you want to, make, toys or tennis shoes, don't come here. We don't want that, they say. You go someplace else. 30 years ago, they wanted that. Today, they don't want that. So you absolutely have to be aware of what the priorities are of the authorities here, and you have to line up. I have a couple of clients who are increasing capacity here. They're adding on to their factories or acquiring new factories. And they say in every place, the Chinese government officials are courting them like they did in the 2000s. They're rolling out the red carpet. They're having dinners. They want your investment here. They really are trying to encourage that. So it feels a little bit of back to the future here, but with a significant twist that the environment today is not the same as it was 30 years ago. So companies can't have that same attitude.
One of the biggest events in global history of the last 100 years in which China has played a central role, in which foreign companies experience directly, and you probably personally, is the pandemic, which probably raised a lot of questions for companies when they weren't able to travel, when they had difficulties getting inputs for their supply chain, a whole variety of things that generated tensions domestically in China and between China and the rest of the world. And we're still seeing some of that. What's the big takeaway of the pandemic experience for multinationals in China and how it still reverberates?
Yeah, and I think we're all processing that right now. I mean, it's a topic of conversation. Those of us who were here, and I was in Shanghai during the whole time, and of course we had a very different experience with the complete lockdown that no one else around the world really had. I think a couple of takeaways. First of all, there was a trend before the pandemic where local teams were able to make more and more decisions, and working with local the C-suite and things like that. They had the authority and the budget to go do what they wanted to do. Yeah, if we're going to spend a lot of money on an acquisition, of course, anybody had to get board approval. But there was a general positivity about China, and they would walk into a situation where everybody was basically optimistic about the China opportunity. This perfect storm during the pandemic of not being able to come to China on the back end of the first wave of the trade war, of really aggressive geopolitical tensions there. China kind of found their voice during the first Trump administration, and that Zhanlang, they call it the wolf warrior kind of mentality, which shouldn't have surprised anybody. I mean, someone yells at you, you yell back, and everyone around the world does that. When the Chinese started to do it, everybody was shocked. And so a combination of things just lent itself to, from optimism, there was a pessimism and a mistrust. And that 3.5 years where executives couldn't visit. I remember talking to clients in the first year of the pandemic, and we were kind of joking around saying, hey, it was kind of nice that headquarters couldn't come. There's, we don't have to babysit. We don't have to do things like that. But then it quickly became apparent that that was the worst thing in the world to happen, that we can't do that. From, the CEO would come and you spend a week with him or her, and, you'd be having dinners, you talk about your family, and it's a very personal thing. Now you get a 45-minute Zoom call every 2 weeks, if you're lucky, during the pandemic. And then China was actually doing really well for quite a while. 2020 and 2021 were record years. And if you were a company where your supply base was in China and your customers were in China, you were doing great. The first early part of 2020, when things were closed down, was tough. But when it opened up again, it just went with a boom. And we could travel freely. We could do all sorts of things here. And the rest of the world was going into shutdown mode. It wasn't until really 2022 when the rest of the world opened up and China arguably stayed closed and tightly closed here in Shanghai for a lot longer than anybody else did. That started to tip things over a little bit. And the level of trust from headquarters to here is something that has changed. I talk to my clients here, and so many of them are saying they have to go to headquarters now for the simplest things to get approval. Headquarters isn't micromanaging. They're kind of micro intelligence gathering. They want to know everything that happens, maybe because they were surprised the first time, all the rest. But headquarters is getting a very different point of view, both in the US and in Europe. This was a few years ago, but a client of mine contacted me here, and the CEO of a company, and she said, do you have a solution for preventing my US-based CEO from watching CNN? She said, because every time he does, he hears a story about China, he gets the wrong end of the stick, he freaks out, he calls me, usually 2 a.m. my time, and, gets really upset. And I said, no, we don't have a censorship service, sorry. But it was this idea that you're seeing one end of things and I'm seeing the other end of things. This client who asked me to do the worst case scenario, she used that 7 blind men and the elephant analogy. We all got a part of the elephant here. And the headquarters has one end and we have another end, and we're defining the problem a little bit differently. We just need to be able to see that elephant. And right now, the headquarters has the bigger voice and the budget. So that ends up being a big point of frustration right now with companies here.
China's economy in 2024 officially grew around 5%. Nominal GDP was only up 4%. The economy has not been doing super well since the darker days of the latter half of the pandemic. Do you think that companies find that the biggest challenge in China, or figuring out the battle back and forth between China and the United States, or are they both equally challenging for companies to manage?
I think it's a layered thing, Scott. They're all kind of piling onto each other. And again, it starts with a either neutral or negative starting point of multinational companies in the view of China. It doesn't apply to anyone. You're in the life sciences sector. You're a medical device company. You still have a pretty buoyant view of the China market here. But a lot of other companies who, until 5 years ago were doing great and had a very positive point of view. That shifted really hard. So all of the Chinese economy and well, what about the real estate sector? And what about this? And what about that? That just kind of piles on and I guess justifies a continued negative point of view. I always tell clients here and I'm, constantly brought in to brief headquarters or boards or something like that. And I say, listen, those of us in China, we need to start our communication with headquarters by identifying where the problems are, where the challenges are. We should be the first ones to identify the risks. Don't let headquarters do that. Don't let headquarters set the narrative. They'll have their own points of view, but we should start with that. Because if we start with, hey guys, there's tons of opportunities, man, we are going to really do great. Headquarters thinks we're naive, and they're not wrong if that's all we see over here. And so we need to present a balanced point of view. This is our responsibility. There's so little that we can control, honestly. This is something we can control from our side over here. And so I think it's critical to be able to do that and to present the headquarters with a point of view. Increasingly, I'm asked by headquarters to help them with a risk assessment or something like that. And they don't want to include the local team, which I find shocking. And they say, well, local team, they're not objective and they're kind of naive and I don't want to scare them. And yeah, but all you get is the part of the elephant that you're holding. You don't get the other part of the elephant. And that doesn't define the elephant here. So we've got to find a way to bring all sides together. But as I tell my clients here, we got to start with our responsibility here and take that.
Listeners should know that this conversation is occurring in early February of 2025, early in the Trump administration, when there's a lot of different possibilities about the way the relationship could go day to day. One just has to watch the headlines. And if you turn away from your computer for an hour, you might miss something. There's a lot of talk about tariffs, other kinds of restrictions, piling on the tech restrictions that the Biden administration had implemented, escalation. There's also talk of a potential grand bargain, Trump going to China or Xi visiting the United States, and disinterest in human rights and perhaps finding some new grand compromise. It's a lot of possibilities. And I want my analysis to China. I want to be open up to surprise, but now there's so many different ways things could go. How do you help a company and clients think about the range of possibilities? Do you line them up in terms of likelihood or the full rainbow? Do you say just ignore one side of it? How should companies be prepared for the possibility of both extreme darkness but unexpected opportunity?
Yeah, and I think it gets back to what I was talking before about scenario planning. And scenario planning up to this point has been, I would argue, not a real serious endeavor by most global companies. For years, we do global scenario planning, and we would always recommend that a global pandemic should be high on the list of risks that you have there. And companies would go, man, but I don't know how I respond to that. And okay, let's call it a black swan. It's just kind of a lazy way of dealing with those kinds of things. And we can't do that anymore. We have to truly think of what are the possibilities out there. The difficulty here is that the way President Trump speaks doesn't lend itself to accurately guessing what's actually going to happen. Trump doesn't speak in strategies. Trump speaks in themes. He's a marketing guy. He's not a business guy. Okay, you can argue that many of the businesses that he's tried to create and run have failed, but he is a brilliant marketer. He is the master of gaining attention. And so when he talks about wanting to buy Greenland, again, Greenland freaks out. That may not be the right point of view. Well, what is it behind that? What is he talking? He's talking about national security. Who was the last person he talked to? That may give you an indication of why he's thinking about that. There's all sorts of things. So for a company here, we think, okay, there's things that we know are going to happen. There's tariffs. There are things that might happen. There's sanctions. There's things that might happen, like a grand deal, like you say. Here's these scenarios. Here's the likelihood of them reaching a certain point here. And I would argue that companies do need to lean more heavily into the worst case scenario planning. If we don't have an understanding of what that worst case scenario is, then we just have kind of boogeyman running around in our brains. And everybody freaks out about the possibility of something happening. Client that we did the worst case scenario planning for, they said one of the biggest benefits was that between here and headquarters, we have a good understanding of if it's going to get bad, how is it going to get bad? And we just all look at the same thing. We all see the elephant, she said, and then we just crack on with work. And then we kind of understand what's going to happen. The critical thing for companies to understand is that what are the triggers along these scenarios? Most companies use the media to identify and manage risk. The media is terrible for doing that. The media is great for identifying and monitoring triggers. So you develop your scenario, and these 7 things have to happen for it to get bad over here. Well, let's look at the media. Let's talk to people. Let's listen to Scott's podcast and go, okay, someone talked about this trigger here. All right, well, let's put it on the map. Let's monitor how things are going like that. It is a mind-numbing, pride-swallowing, paranoia-inducing process. It is hard. If it's not hard, you're not doing it right. And so I think that's a switch that companies have to make now.
I really like this emphasis on themes. Even in, I think, following other administrations, you could identify a theme and a strategy, and you could expect potential policies. So the Biden administration's approach towards technology of de-risking, you could tell that it was not just starting in one sector, but it was going to expand to other industries, and it was always going to be a moving target. Trump talks about challenges, about being on the short end of deficits and being tricked and not wanting to turn things around. And he's got a whole bunch of complaints and things that he thinks are unfair in the world. But that doesn't really tell us precisely what is going to happen, because he could address that unfairness in so many different ways. One of the challenges that's particularly new is the China side of that equation. Is not only is it difficult to predict what the Trump administration may do, but how China is likely to respond. And so my sense is that China, having gone through this before with Trump 1 and going through the Biden administration, is that, I don't know if I'd say that they're fed up, but I feel like they feel like if they don't push back on some of this, it actually might encourage an escalation. What is your sense about how the Chinese are thinking about how to handle Trump when they do their own analysis?
I would agree with you, Scott. I think China's response is a great unknown here. I think a couple of things. We can assume for the moment that China is going to be very careful in their response. China is still very tied to the U.S. and very tied to NATO countries economically and all the rest. So they're going to be very careful. China has responded to other things in the past, but it's not been proportional. And we always look at proportionality. Okay, how are they going to respond to the Chips and Science Act, the IRA, things like that? You can argue that it wiped out technology restrictions from the U.S., wiped out a $5 billion handset business from Huawei. What was China's response? Well, it took about a year and a half, 2 years. And then they, gave some fines, $200 million fines on the chip companies and things like that. Chip companies that were already investing in China, continuing investing. And so, but that was their response to it. The U.S. puts an entity list up there and populates it with hundreds of Chinese companies. China has an entity list as well, but it has, I last count 4, 5, 6 companies on it. It's got the form, but the function is not the same. So I think they're going to be quite careful. They are going to be a little bit more using bullets rather than bombs. They're going to try to be a little bit more strategic in what they do to try to make it hurt. I think there's going to be some passive resistance as well. They did that with phase 1, the trade deal. A lot of nodding and signatures and things like that. And really what happened at the end was not much. They just kind of went along. Again, President Trump is a marketer. He still talks about that as being the best trade deal ever signed in the world. That's just kind of how he talks like that. And China, I think, is smart enough to let him talk that way. You can see a real dialing back of that wolf warrior mentality. They don't want to try to poke the bear. They really kind of enjoyed it in 2017, 2018. It was kind of fun to get a reaction out of that. It's the, what my little brother used to do to me growing up. He just loved to see the reaction, So I think they're going to be more careful, but they're not going to roll over. They're certainly not going to do that. So I think any response will be, for the moment, not proportional and delayed. I don't see China taking at least right now. It could change in 6 months or a year, but I don't see China taking the initiative on these things. It is going to be reactive and responsive. The U.S. is going to be the primary actor.
So this brings me to a final question or topic. So you clearly, this discussion has showed, have a sense of humor. You have enough of a sense of humor that you also spend time actually as a stand-up comedian and help others process the world in which they live, which has gone through some very challenging times. I don't need you to do a set with us tonight, although I would really enjoy it. And I will not try any of my jokes on you. My kids, my wife, they have said, do not do that. And so I promise that I won't do that and impose any pain on you or the listeners. But could you give us a little sense about comedy as an outlet, as a way to think about and process the world, and what it's like to be a comic in China?
Yeah, it's interesting to say the least. I go back to when I first started doing it, which was about 9 years ago, I guess. And I was going through an incredibly difficult time, both professionally and personally. And frankly, to be honest, kind of felt like a failure in a couple of different things. And I mean, it's maybe arrogant to say, but I wasn't used to feeling like a failure. I've been pretty successful, and that all felt good. But that failure was feeling quite terminal. I went with a friend who was doing an open mic thing and got up there and just sat there for an hour and a half and watched people bomb person after person after person. There wasn't even a polite giggle in the 90 minutes that was up there. And I walked out of there going, well, first of all, I could do that. I can talk without getting a laugh. And number two, none of those people died. Figuratively, metaphorically, you die on stage, but you didn't die. It wasn't terminal. And so I looked at this as an opportunity to try something new, I give a lot of speeches and I inject humor in all of my talks, no matter what I'm doing, or I try to. But to purposefully do that was a personal challenge to me. But in terms of processing China, I do it all over the world and do it all over Asia, most of it in China because this is where I live. But a lot of it is kind of the fish out of water. I am the number one butt of my jokes, and I have endless material, for saying, believing something stupid. And it's amazing how an audience and people in general react if you poke fun at yourself and act like you're learning, because you are, and to be a learner. It's amazing what a positive response is from an audience. It happens with clients. It happens with friends. I found it's a really healthy way to live. And I think it's made me a better analyst. It's made me a better advisor to be able to do that, as well as just, it's so much fun that it's hard to describe.
Well, I, for one, will never make a joke at your expense because I know you're a lot bigger than me and you'd kick my butt. So I'm not going to do that. But I will try and catch your show at some point, whether it's in China or elsewhere, and I would encourage other listeners to do so as well. You have graced us with your presence on China Field Notes, helped us understand China from another perspective. I'm really grateful, Kent, for the time that you've spent with us, and I know the listeners will be too. So again, thank you for joining us.
It was an honor. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks for listening to China Field Notes. Stay up to date with our latest releases by following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to great content. Until next time.